We're going to let people come in for a minute or so, and then we're going to get started. We're going to get started here in just a minute. So welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied fields related to the built environment. Today we have repairing past harm. Do designers and planners have a role? With Mitchell Silver and interviewer moderator Mallory Baches. And you can register for coming webinars next week at 12 noon on Tuesday. Our usual date and time, we have a Black urbanist journey to an accessible queer feminist future with Kristen Jeffers. And the following week, we have an authors forum with Seth Kaplan, who is the author of Fragile Neighborhoods. Go to cnu.org/resources/on-the-park-bench for upcoming webinars and to sign up. And of course, join CNU or renew your membership at members.cnu.org/memberships. And of course, go to Public Square, CNU Journal for news and commentary on the urbanism field, www.cnu.org/publicsquare. Today, we feature a presentation of the harm inflicted on Black communities by the planning profession and what we can do about it. We're going to be recreating a main stage presentation from CNU 31 in Charlotte. And so we're going to have that. That was not recorded, but was a very popular presentation. We're trying to bring it to a larger audience. So Mitchell Silver is a professional planner who is a former New York City Parks Commissioner and has held many positions of honor in the field, such as President of the American Planning Association, President of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He's had a long and distinguished career. He's a member of CNU's Board of Directors. Mallory Baches, CNU President, will be the interviewer and moderator for this session. Mallory has 25 years of international work in urban planning and community development and a wealth of experience in nonprofit leadership. And she's coming to us today from Detroit, where she's at the Better Cities Film Festival. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. First, there's going to be a presentation followed by a brief discussion between Mitch and Mallory, and then a Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And now I am going to pass this along to Mitch. If I can.
Are we good?
Okay.
Yes, we are. Okay. Well, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in this country. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you. And as Rob stated, this is a main stage presentation I gave along with Marcus King in Charlotte. So you will see a reference to Charlotte at the front end, but right now I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. This was a conversation as part of code reform. And so it was my privilege, both Marcus and I, to share our perspective about why it is important to address code reform. But the real question is, as we look at a lot of past harm, what is the role of planners and designers? And so This was something that I spent about a year working on and have some practical tools that people can explore. And so I certainly look forward to your questions. So since I was in Charlotte, it was very important that since addressing past harm, we must acknowledge what happened in the past. I wanted to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. We were in Charlotte for centuries. The land known as Charlotte was home to and cared for by Native peoples. These include the Catawba, the Chirwa, the Sugaree, the Wateree, and the Waxhaw people. We commit to honoring their history, presence, and future. We also acknowledge the unjust practices and harm imposed on enslaved people and generations of Black Americans who reside or resided on the land. The reason why I bring this up is that there is this neighborhood called Brooklyn Village in Charlotte. It's located in the Second Ward, and the Brooklyn neighborhood was predominantly Black community that thrived as really a sustainable town within the town of Charlotte. But during the 1960s and 70s, Brooklyn was razed in Charlotte's first wave of urban renewal, displacing thousands of neighborhood residents and ultimately destroyed more than 1,400 structures. The reason why I call that out is where we met in Charlotte, literally we were right next to the Brooklyn neighborhood. So as people were enjoying the conference and walking through the streets nearby our venue site, wanted to say exactly that there was a neighborhood here that no longer exists. And so it's important that we recognize the places that we reside in, while it looks great, actually did create some past harm. And in fact, if people walked out of the building, they would literally see a sign called East Brooklyn Village, which was a remnant of what used to be there. So it's very important that as we plan for places, we have got to understand the history, because there are still people that have memories of the Brooklyn Village. And we can't just start from scratch. We have to have conversations about the places we plan and design for, because people are still holding these very harmful and painful memories. Now, as was stated, I served as both president of the American Planning Association and the American Institute of Certified Planners. And what is always important to me is I always like to look at the ethics of our professional organizations. It gives us our sense of purpose by establishing these aspirational values and, of course, rules of conduct. And throughout my career, I always looked at the code of ethics. It gave me my purpose. It told me what I was supposed to do. And I was so gratified that a few years ago, we decided to double down and actually make a pledge about how we're going to conduct ourselves as professionals. Now, I'm sure Mallory will tell you, but CNU is now embarking on taking a fresh look at their charter. And equity and diversity and inclusion is part of that effort. But it's very important that we make this pledge so that we communicate to the public, what do we stand for? You know, what are our values? And so for me, that is critically important. The reason why I say this, we are going through an amendment process, and so it's open to the public to submit amendments to the charter. But before that happened, in September of 2018, the board wanted to take a stand in CNU. It wasn't put into the charter, but they did say the promise of the charter is that it can only be fulfilled by identifying and confronting exclusionary policies, practices, and behaviors, empowering those that have been most affected, and committing ourselves to accelerating actions and strategies that foster more inclusive communities. So it is our hope that as we have this conversation, this very powerful language adopted by the board could find its way as part of the amended charter. But I want to now shift gears to the American Institute of Certified Planners. As I told you, it gave me the passion, the courage, the inspiration to address issues. So I'm not going to go through all the principles, but there was one that really moved me as a very young professional. And that one that we needed to recognize as planners, our unique responsibility to eliminate historic patterns of inequity tied to planning decisions represented in documents such as zoning ordinances and land use plans. And moreover, that we as planners need to recognize and work to mitigate the impacts of existing plans and procedures that result in patterns of discrimination, displacement, and environmental justice. I've used that as a rallying cry. And when I go into a neighborhood, I have these all top of mind. So whether it's a comprehensive plan or a master plan or zoning changes, we'll look very carefully at what these documents say so we can create a better path going forward. So this term repairing past harm really comes out of the term reparations. A lot of people have a very visceral reaction when they hear that word, but I just want to do a very quick overview of reparations in the United States. To be clear, it's a system of redress for egregious injustices, and this is not foreign to the United States. Native Americans had received land and billions of dollars through various programs and treaties because they were forcibly exiled from their native lands. Japanese Americans received 1.5 billion. They were paid for those that were interred during World War II. The United States, through the Marshall Plan, helped to ensure Jews receive reparations from the Holocaust. And then in 1952, West Germany agreed to pay 3.5 billion Deutsche Marks to Holocaust survivors. But the main point is that Black Americans, enslaved people, are the only groups that have not received reparations from state-sanctioned discrimination. Now, a lot of my friends, and when they have these conversations, like saying, wait a minute, that did not happen under my watch. Why are you pointing to me to address or repair these past harms? The only way I can make this clear comparison is that I want to look at toxic dumps. Some of you may remember Love Canal. This was a company that dumped 22,000 tons of toxic waste on a site in Buffalo. They buried it and then sold the land to the city for $1. And a city developed it. And about 25 years later, in fact, let me go to that slide. The Hooker Chemical Company, 1953, they covered up the earth and sold it to the city for $1. And 25 years later, 82 different compounds, and 11 of them suspected of carcinogens, started to leach in basements and schoolyards and backyards. They created devastating harm to this community. Now, 25 years later, the planners and the mayor who were there today said, I wasn't here 25 years ago when the Hooker Chemical Company dumped all this stuff. So I don't have any obligation to clean it up. Wrong. You're here now. And that toxic dump is now creating harm to the community. The question is, what do you do? Now, clearly the company was fined over $100 million to clean it up because we had an obligation to address the past harm, even though we weren't here when that harm was created. And so the toxicity is not just caused by hazardous waste, but it's also caused by centuries of hazardous systemic racism. No, you weren't here when people were enslaved. No, you may not have been here when there was harsh Jim Crow laws, but you're here now. And the question is, do you let that toxicity affect our neighborhoods, or do you have an obligation to repair past harm? We can go the landscape across America. And in fact, we all know that some of the bills that the president is issuing to kind of knit together and connect neighborhoods destroyed by highways and urban renewal. For example, Mallory is in Detroit. Black Bottom in the Detroit neighborhood was destroyed to make way for the I-75 and the I-375 corridor. These were thriving Black communities that were destroyed by highways and urban renewal plans, something the Congress for New Urbanism has at the top of their list of priority to help stitch not just the urban fabric, but these neighborhoods together. When I taught school, graduate school in New York City, almost every student, when it was time to do their paper, wanted to talk about the Cross Bronx Expressway. Robert Moses' way of moving traffic through New York City, but literally destroyed neighborhoods. Till this day, there are families that talk about how this destroyed their lives by just taking away buildings, the livelihood, the culture, what people knew and where they played in the street. There are still effects today. And to go further, and I was very intrigued as Rob posted, or CNU posted this presentation, my good friend Joe Menicosi, who I'm sure you all know, is doing a lot of research on this wealth gap. And he shared with me some slides about the lost wealth in a lot of places in South Carolina and North Carolina. But this whole thing about the 40 acres to the mule, which was a way of, I guess, attempt to address reparations, that was overturned some years later. But to think about the value of the 40 acres and the mule had it continued, this would have enriched those homeowners $640 billion today. That's the wealth that was lost from those 40,000 freed slaves because their property was taken back and given to others. In fact, and this is from Bloomberg News, slaves or enslaved people lost an estimated $20.3 trillion, not billion, $1 trillion in lost wages for their labor. So this country was built on $20 trillion of free labor. That is devastating harm, and we have to be sensitive to that. And then Brookings Institute did a study, and they estimated Black-owned homes are undervalued by 23% for a total of 156 billion of lost wealth in the United States. And Joe is doing it city by city or town by town. So again, reach out to him if you want to find out more about his work. The United States have really struggled to deal with this issue of past harm, particularly when it comes to Black Americans. H.R. 40 was first introduced in Congress in 1989 and proposes to create a federal commission just to study reparations and recommend some remedies. And in the 117 Congress, that was the last one, introduced the bill again in 2019. It failed. And so that one bill just to study the impact of past harm has been stalled for 30 years. But on the local level, we have a lot of state and local governments that are stepping up to address past harm. I'll go through a couple of what they're doing. The only state doing it right now that's studying it is California, and you can see all the other cities on a local level that are trying to find a way of addressing and repairing this past harm. And let me add, I'd say about half of the work that I'm doing today are clients looking to, in some way, address the past harm. Those are the projects that are near and dear to my heart and that I'm actually pursuing. So California in 2020 became the first state in the country to establish a state reparations task force. And nearly 2 years later, the panel released its first report last month outlining the state's involvement in slavery and how it continues to harm Black Americans. Evanston, what they're doing there is that the city gave 16 Black residents $25,000 each to put toward a down payment on a home, mortgage, or home repair. This payout was intended to make up for discriminatory housing practices Black residents experienced between 1919 and 1969. A city where I worked, they created a reparations commission in March of 2022. And their goal is to have a commission that will help repair the damage caused by public and private systemic racism. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the city apologized for its role in institutional and structural racism experienced by Black residents. In this case, they have an advisory committee that is going to establish a framework for a reparations commission. Mallory, again, she's in a great place right now, Detroit. The city's new task force, is a result of a ballot initiative that was passed by Detroit residents during the November 2021 election, when more than 80% of Detroiters turned out and supported the creation of a task force focused on housing and economic development programs. And this 13-member body will research harm done to Detroiters through slavery and systemic racism practices of the past and also the present. And in New England, we have Amherst. In this case, the town council approved the creation of a fund to allocate $2 million in reparations over the course of a decade, affirming the town of Amherst's commitment to end structural racism and achieve racial equity for Black Americans. So to understand our past harm, the question is, do planners and designers have a role to address repairing past harm? Clearly, we do not have the ability to create legislation or appoint a commission or a task force, but we, as planners and designers, whether in APA or CNU, we must acknowledge and recommend how to repair past harm because the implications are still with us today. And so you all know another term for repairing past harm is also called restorative justice. We all know some of these urban planning practices. Some of my colleagues said sprawl was damaging. Yeah, it was. But to many Black Americans and people of color, there were other issues that really created harm. Redlining, segregation, urban renewal plans, the use of eminent domain, public policy, restrictive covenants. I can go on and on. Homeowners associations, uneven code enforcement. So this is not even a full list, but a partial list of some of those unjust planning practices, both past and present, that we have to be cognitive of. Now, I was very privileged to attend the California APA Diversity Summit just blew me away. They introduced something I knew about, but a lot of people in the audience did not know about the existence of sundown towns. There was actually a QR code that you could scan to find out the sundown towns in your state. If you don't know what it is, if you were Black, caught in any town or rural area when the sun went down, basically you could have been killed. And so they wanted to make sure that they were the first in California to recognize the history of sundown towns and wanted to make sure that they understood the impact. What was so powerful about this conference is that they outlined for me in a way that just crystallized, what's the first step to really repairing past harm? And it's quite simple. It's to acknowledge, is to apologize, and then is to atone. Now, there are many places that are now doing land acknowledgements and are acknowledging the past harm. You also see some places, as you saw from some of the cities I share with you, will apologize for the harm created, but then the atone part. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where it becomes very difficult. It's not just monetary reparations. There are different things planners and designers could recommend as they do their work. So Glendale confronted its racist past, and they apologized. They publicly apologized for the sundown laws that existed in Glendale, even though it did occur in many other towns and villages and cities in California. And then with the unanimous passage of a resolution, Spartanburg apologized to Black residents. So you see this movement happening across the country. Places really want to confront their very dark past, even though they weren't present at the time, recognizing that that harm created, that toxicity, if it wasn't cleaned up, still exists in many of these underserved communities. And so this is a list that I want you to pay very close attention to. Here are some of the recommendations as a beginning for planners and designers they should do. Apologize at the beginning of a public engagement process. Believe it or not, I'll show you a project shortly in Texas where I started the meeting apologizing to the residents for the harm created by the planning profession. I apologized. They looked at me and said, "What did you just say?" It changed the entire tone of the meeting because I acknowledged that we don't always get it right, but in the past, the planning profession did very, very painful things as this community, and we're not just going to let it go under the rug. We're going to talk about it. I also recommend that we actually conduct a study to understand the implications of past harm so we can avoid them in the future, because we didn't just address past harm, we should avoid creating any new harm. And so it's important you have those conversations. Undertake an equity audit. Use fairness as a new methodology for making decisions. Protect sacred sites and buildings. In many Black communities or communities of color, it's not just the architecture, it's not just the design, it's the memories, it's the experiences that took place in these places and spaces and buildings. And we need to understand it and acknowledge it. In fact, in Oklahoma City, CNU had a legacy project to help preserve the Jewel Theater. Those are one of those sacred sites that meant a lot to the community. Every other building in that era demolished, but the Jewel Theater remained, and now there's this ongoing effort to restore the Jewel Theater as a way to catalyze development in that part of Oklahoma City. Suggest tax relief for vulnerable areas. This is hitting directly to the fear of gentrification. Can this be done? Can taxes remain stable so people are not forced out of where they live? Allow urban renewal areas to sunset. When I was plan director, we couldn't change state law, but we allowed those urban renewal plans just to sunset. And we work with the community to co-create a plan for the future rather than a tool that the eminent domain could be used to take their property. And then finally, listen with empathy. What do I mean by that? I was privileged to write the afterword for a book that's coming out in January called Planning and Designing with Empathy. And the reason why I say empathy is that as planners and designers, we must attain the ability to understand how other people feel in a situation from their point of view and not our own. And so that's something that's critically important. And so this whole book, Empathic Design, is really trying to understand our perspectives and how to create these inclusive spaces. So I mentioned to you that this is the place. This is in Denton, Texas. It's in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. We were hired to come up with an area plan. because there was a lot of harm created in this community, and the city in Texas recognized there's something they had to do. Theirs was this predominantly Black area called Quaker. It was right next to downtown, very affluent. You can see from the map, this was a very well affluent community. During this time, this community was raising money for war bonds, and so the white community was losing its wealth, and no one went to the Black community, and so they were able to reinvest. And you can see from the photos, it was very thriving. But this also intersected with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. They were very troubled by the existence of this very well-to-do Black community right next to downtown. And because they got experience raising money for war bonds, they started raising money for park bonds and decided to remove this community, all the residents, and they created a park. Here is the park today. Most Black residents do not go to this park because of the painful memories that it creates. And during our public meetings, they kept saying, we don't want another Quaker town. There are still people alive today that have memories of what happened in Quaker Town. They're older now, but they were younger when everyone was asked to move. And it's celebrating its 100th year this year. So this is something that we're working through in Denton, Texas. I was hired by the city of Asheville to come up with a plan for the Pack Square Plaza. This is the Vance Monument. He was a governor who was a slave owner, was known as a white supremacist. And right after Black Lives Matter, the residents started to demand that this monument come down. The Black residents never felt comfortable in this space because of that monument. And so the county and city agreed to take the monument down. You're now seeing when it was dismantled sometime in 2022. And so they wanted to come up with a plan, and there's the base that's remaining. It's now in North Carolina Supreme Court because some residents want the monument back. But our goal was to create a space for healing, for unity, a social gathering place where everyone feels welcome. And so that project was just completed actually last week, and it was approved by the city council. But what was meaningful about this were the community conversations. They were difficult to hear. We had to really understand the importance of the harm that was created and spent a lot of time in focus groups and listening sessions listening. And I'll never forget the moment where we had to stop the meeting because there's one woman who was white. Her father owned a supermarket, and it was set on fire. It was in the Black community, and the firefighters in Asheville would not go to that supermarket to put out the fire. And it was all the Black residents that came to her father's aid to put it out. And so in that moment, it was emotional. I had to stop the meeting, throw out the agenda, because this woman, Babette, her father was part of the people who put out the fire, were right there, started hugging. It was this moment of intense unity. And that's the magic of when you listen and talk about some of that harm. It was painful. Her father was Jewish, which could have added to some of the problems. But the bottom line is, it was this very powerful moment of seeing this community come together. And so for us, the engagement was so critical to this process. You could read some of the themes. It came from the community and it informed the design process. And so for us, it was important to create new spaces in the plaza for civic engagement, expression, storytelling, oral history, public art. And we showed some precedent images. In the upper left-hand corner, it was how we were going to redesign the space. But more importantly, we wanted to reposition this underused space in front of the Biltmore building as a meditation grove, that people can go and start the healing process. And so that's what we shared with them. So I do want to pivot now as I close to the importance of the policy guide. I'm so proud that in 2023, the American Planning Association released a policy guide on zoning for equity. And so this is available to you. You can just Google it and download it. It's a PDF. And you see right here the table of contents. I have to say how proud I was as a planner that APA took this on to really give a toolkit for planners and designers and those that are doing code reform on what you need to look at if you want to now design, not just for form and for use and for roads and sidewalks, but about equity. And so this is pretty powerful. They broke it up to 3 parts. One that deals with equity in the rules, equity in the people, and then equity in the map. And so all that is described in that report that you can download. It gets into very distinct areas about zoning, form and design, use regulations, development standards. I think we all know that right now a big issue being discussed is home occupation use. That could be very difficult for certain communities about what they allow, how many unrelated individuals can live in one home. So really start to unpack these rules. Why were they intended to be there, and how we can reform them and change them going forward. And in terms of people, make sure the composition of our zoning commissions are reflect the community. Avoid overcomplicated regulations. As we all know, too many regulations can drive up the cost of housing. And if we truly want to have attainable and affordable housing, we need to look carefully at our regulations. And then a big issue we hear is notification. A lot of places of color are very upset about the notification process. It's not too far, not enough, they're not engaged. And then these developments happen without their knowledge. And so there's a lot of pushback. And so each state governs the distance from 400 to 800 to 1,000. Even if there's a cemetery in between, people do not get notified. And so really rethink our notification process so people who are most affected can be part of the process. And then, of course, zoning maps, make them more land available for the right development, remove disparities, and also have fewer inclusionary lines to make sure, and that's something we all believe in, that we have a much more mixed use districts. So as I wrap up, I want to share again what I said up front. These are our aspirational values, both as planners and as designers. So I don't have to repeat it. I said at the front end, and also share with you again the statement from the board, which we hope will now be part of the amendment, a charter amendment process that will be voted on in Cincinnati. So as I close, I really want you to embrace your sense of purpose, your charter and values as designers and planners, to design, plan, and code for the future, but also to address or repair past harm. I thank you for your time, and now I look forward to Mallory's questions, and then ultimately I get to hear from you, the audience. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for that. That was fantastic. And for folks who weren't in Charlotte, or for those who were for CNU 31 and got to hear this live on stage, it's a conversation that I think you know, I want to dive into some of the details of, but I also think that it is an area that for many of us in our practice, we are continuing to learn and expand how we deliver new urbanism, where we are delivering these principles to, whom is participating in that process. And so I'm really grateful for you to walk us through your wisdom about how we need to think about that differently, more expansively, and with more clarity on the harm that we are coming in to repair in the first place. So I wanted to start off, you discussed the charter amendment process, which we just launched on Monday. And for folks that might be viewing this and haven't seen much of our communications, we have put a full blast out about this, and we'll continue to for the next 2 months. But CNU, the board of CNU, has authorized this process for considering ways that the charter could be expanded, amended, added to in a way to consider the fundamental principles of our work after 30 years since the charter was first being drafted. And so I wanted to ask you, that question I sort of brought up about adding layers to our work, or expanding our scope as new urbanists. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on, the new urbanism is a movement 30 plus years long. You have a incredible career spanning longer than that, sir. I wonder if you could reflect on how widely, as we look at cities, we have come to learn more as professionals impacting the urban realm, and what you see as added learning we still need to do. And it, to me, this sort of adds to what are the harms that we aren't currently considering, that we need to, continue to expand our understandings of and adapt our practice as a result.
let me just say, we continue to evolve. There's no question the color of law was a game changer, and it was a way of articulating the harm that a lot of people did not see. The book was well written. It was very specific to places and spaces we all recognized. When I went to planning school, I was very upset when the color of law came out because I didn't know this when I was in planning school. I knew about urban renewal. I knew about some other harms, but he was able to put it all together in a way that we can see it. And so now young people coming out of school speak a very different language. And then the whole civil and social unrest, I give credit to the Gen Z population. They just have to keep up the momentum. It's not just about protest, it's about staying active and seeing that change that really changed the conversation. And so reparations has been around for a long time. Repairing past harm has been a long time. But I think we're at that moment where people are now seeing the disparity growing between the rich and the poor. Affordable housing continues to be an issue. Homelessness keeps rising. And so we as planners and designers, we can't ignore that it's not a clean slate. We do have an obligation to be protectors. I didn't share all of our code of ethics, but it's our job. It's not just about land use patterns. It's not just about the built environment. It's the people who exist there. And I see now this more of a recognition of people that want to go beyond just the bricks, the mortar, but really look at the people that they're planning for. So I've seen that evolution in my career. And so for me, I'm just pleased at where we're going. I just want to make sure all generations keep their foot on the gas pedal, because when you hear these stories about the past harm, it makes me more determined to do whatever I can to address the past harm, but also avoid making new harm.
Harms. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And being willing and responsible to acknowledge that we are continuing to learn from our efforts. One thing I talk to a lot of new urbanists about is that this is a movement of innovation, and you have to be mindful that innovation is involving the lives of human beings.
Right. And like I said, I love my new urbanist colleagues, and we have this big debate about sprawl. Yes, sprawl is harmful, but it's a development pattern. I'm looking more at the harm, the lost wealth, these amazing, beautiful neighborhoods that were wiped away because we had to have a highway. It's not just stitching, creating a boulevard from what a highway is. But what about the culture, the wealth, the activities? We have projects all over the country, from Indiana to Detroit, that's not just trying to stitch the urban fabric together, but trying to stitch the soul of community back together.
Yeah. Well, so that's going to lead me to another question that I have here in Detroit, as you mentioned. Along with the Better Cities Film Festival, which is happening here this weekend, which is why I'm here, in conjunction with CNU Michigan and a whole lot of CNU affiliate organizations and action groups. And so there's going to be a number of panel discussions associated with films. And one of those is, I was just this morning talking with your CNU 31 co-presenter, Marcus King, another CNU board member who's here in Detroit. And he's going to be on a panel talking about the discussion around, as you brought up, Interstate 375 and the removal of that interstate, that urban renewal project that massively separated portions of the city. And I wonder, CNU has had 8 publications of the Freeways Without Features reports, which are great in elevating the need in local communities to remove these urban freeways, these urban highways that have had such and continue to have such devastating consequences for the communities. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, that idea of expanding our scope, that it isn't just about taking the monstrosity out. It's about the work that then comes on the other side of that to bring the communities to truly restore the communities that were damaged. And these are social issues, they're physical design challenges, they are policy issues. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, when you look at these sorts of projects, what you're looking for as key indicators of going beyond just the removal of the infrastructure that was problematic.
Yeah, number one, I don't want to put all the pressure on planners and designers. We have to have a multidisciplinary team. There are those out there, my good friend in Canada, Jay Pitter, that just did the Little Jamaica Cultural District. You got to reach out to the storytellers, Dr. Andrew Roberts, who did the Texas Colony Project, that know this work. And as we do this work, we have to bring in those. And in some cases, you need to bring in a therapist because some of these conversations are quite painful. And the ability to talk about some of the past harm and those that help us heal. That is all part of the growth process, the rebuilding process. So look, we're talented planners and designers, but we have to start reaching out to those other professionals that will really understand what is going on. I often say, I remember after Black Lives Matter, all my allies say, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And I'm like saying, can you stop for a second? The first question you should ask is, how do I feel? And asking how do I feel with empathy starts to understand what is the design process? What do we have to do? As planners, we seem to have all these, bike lanes and this and that. We have all the tools that we could put in place, but are we listening first? And what's right for this community? What may happen in Kansas City may be different than Detroit, may be different than Oklahoma City. And so it has to be local. You need to have a multidisciplinary team, but there has to be a healing process, not just to heal the fabric, but also to heal the community. And so to me, that's something I would recommend. Make sure you have a multidisciplinary team that understands past harm and how do you plan a way forward.
Yeah. Well, that sort of leads me into, I'm going to jump into the Q&A. There are a lot of good questions here. And one of these is not just about repairing the past investments, but Ryan Kelly said he'd love to hear more on what criterion might be for a fairness methodology for capital projects. So thinking about not creating more harm.
Right. So in New York City, when I was commissioner, I actually took the job because the mayor got me on that equity button. And the first thing we did is we came up basically with areas that were vulnerable, kind of a vulnerability index of neighborhoods. And then we did analysis to take a look at where investment occurred over 20 years. You can't hide those numbers. And once we looked at it, it blew us away. For some reason, of all of our investments, certain neighborhoods were just left out. Everyone pays taxes. Even if you pay rent, you pay your taxes through your rent. How could it be after 20 years, these places were neglected? So when you do a capital plan, you certainly want to look at state of good repair. You want to look at growth, but equity in terms of making sure you're distributing those capital projects equally. And time was one consideration. In New York City, we looked at this continuum, and there were, of our 2,000 parks, 10% hadn't received any investment in over 2 decades. And so that group went to the top of the list. A lot of people said, that's not fair, that's not fair. Equity means fairness. And for us, we look at what was invested in various parts of the city. Yes, a lot of people want to invest in downtown because it's catalytic, but we also want to invest in quality neighborhoods to make them stable. And so it's not fair that taxpayers in underserved communities are subsidizing places that are more affluent. So the first thing we do is we look at how capital dollars are distributed. And for new capital plans or capital project improvement plans, we want to make sure there's a criteria in the decision-making that has fairness and distribution across the whole city is done fairly.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point to think about the new urbanist movement, that we are, there are many planners. I'm a certified planner. There are a lot of folks working in the planning profession, but also a lot of other professions, both in municipal governance, but also in the private sector, that are impacting these projects from a variety of angles. They may be contracted in to work on projects. They may have oversight or need to work in concert. Someone from a Department of Transportation working in concert with someone from the Department of Planning, in order to make sure that the fairness is, this is an intricate system. Embedding the fairness is a multilateral strategy.
And with GIS, this is very easy to do. I remember there was one city council member, she heard me talk about this some years ago. Her assistant city manager did the assignment. And in the middle of the meeting, once they saw where investment took place over 20 years, the assistant city manager, apologized to the council member because it was right there in plain sight. And he was blown away that the community she represented really saw no investment. 20 years. You can imagine the hundreds of millions of dollars that everyone paid into the taxes. So the point I'm making is that using not just fairness, but fairness, state of good repair. There are other criteria. If you need a new fire station because the response time needs to be improved, but equity, fairness needs to be one of the criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question here from Nick Rogers.
Oh, hey, Nick.
I like to announce the names when I moderate these, because oftentimes folks know who these questions are coming from. So Nick said, what do you recommend that communities consider for accounting for and addressing the harmful damage that past practices, such as those mentioned, when that harm resulted in the complete eradication of Black neighborhoods? If no one is left to heal and to rebuild, an interpretive plaque doesn't feel like a proportional response.
I mean, this varies from place to place. There are some places where the entire Black community was wiped out, but there's still this affection. There is still memories of that place. In some cases, people have moved away, but the church is still there. And so there's no question it varies from, there are some people that remained, they're all gone. To me, it's still important that you find different approaches. You know, in New York City, we, after Black Lives Matter, did this process with the public where we identified spaces and places that were renamed, but it was intentional. It wasn't just a name. It was a community process that allowed them to pick names. So for example, Lena Horne grew up in Brooklyn. We renamed the Prospect Park bandshell the Lena Horne bandshell. The crowd went crazy. Actually, it was my last day as commissioner in New York City. But it's Malcolm X Promenade, where he lived, right near LaGuardia Airport. So naming is not the only thing, but how do you create those spaces? How do you rebuild it to make sure that it's intentional, that those that used to live there can find their way back? So Nick, very hard question because it's different scales that you're dealing with. But if you look at some of the tools I left, it gives you some opportunity to think about what you can do, particularly some of those sacred sites and places and buildings. The Audubon Ballroom, where Malcolm X was assassinated. Young planner, I worked on that space to make sure it was preserved, even though the whole area had changed. So it's a hard question, but you have to be intentional, have conversation about the past harm, and then of those tools I suggested, figure out a way that you at least could repair, acknowledge, and atone for that past harm.
Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of interrelated questions here that I'm going to try to weave together for you. The first is from Howard Blackson, who says, past harms were applied over many generations. Should we expect to heal these harms in one generation? And how do we address climate mitigation and adaptation difference in addressing long-term generational changes, knowing, of course, that there is intersectionality between the anticipated climate impact harms that will continue to reinforce malinvested communities in the first place?
There's no question we have climate refugees, people of color in terms of environmental injustice. They're at the top of the list, whether being moved to flood-prone areas, not having proper insurance. There's no question that it's also climate change and environmental hazards that are creating harm. We have to deal with the generation with us now because they're the ones we're interacting with. But we also have to recognize that generational trauma is passed down generation to generation. And so that's why it's important to apologize and acknowledge. To me, it's the beginning of the healing process. But to me, these can't be just empty gestures. It has to be followed up with atonement, and that could take many different forms. And so the person who asked the question, I agree 100% that it goes beyond just racism. We now see it embedded in our landscapes through climate and through environmental hazards. But to me, we have to deal with the generation that's here now. They're the ones that we're engaging, but also recognize and acknowledge that it passed down generation to generation, and each person, place, family may experience that harm very differently. We just have to acknowledge it and recognize it's there and not just start the planning process at day one as if nothing else before it ever occurred.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It sort of makes me think of what you mentioned earlier about sort of continuing to redress our own work to ensure that those ways that we are attempting to improve lives are in fact doing exactly what we have intention towards.
And the toxic dump is probably the best example. If that is not cleaned up, one, that land cannot be used, but it can leak out and affect other places. The same is happening with these communities that experienced toxicity from racism or environmental injustice. It is still there. And I have a hard time saying, well, it didn't happen under my watch. I didn't do anything about it. The question is, do planners and designers and urbanists today have the courage to start to unpack that, to talk about it? And do we feel as if we have an obligation to address some of those past harms? I can't leave that toxic dump unchanged. We've been cleaning up contaminated sites all over the country. What about our neighborhoods?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it speaks to another question here that, asked to just talk about the urgency of addressing the harm, and continuing and compounding harm. We risk delaying, you're sort of creating a compound interest situation of this only continues to exacerbate. But it also makes me think of a question or a thought that I had for you when you were during your presentation, and you talked about empathy, addressing, sort of starting from a position of empathy, of attempting to first understand what other people's experiences are that might be different from our own. As you know, CNU is working on better exploring ways that inclusion in our own practice can be that we can be more successful in an inclusionary practice, so that we can better understand how to do so and what that looks like in applied fashion. And it made me think of something that actually Marcus brought up at the main stage at CNU 31, that the new urbanism is in many ways has a primed focus on the public realm, and the experience of the public realm just as a place in space is significantly different for different groups of people. And being able to empathize, for example, that when your example of Quakertown in Denton, Texas made me really think about this, that the public realm has been a space of public humiliation for groups of people, in a way that I think as a white woman, I intend to be empathetic with, but also is not my lived reality or my generation's, my family's lived reality. And I wonder if you could, I know that you spent a lot of time with the New York Parks Commission there in New York City. I wonder if you could talk about how that empathy is supported and encouraged. The idea of naming after Lena Horne is something, that's someone folks love, but is that enough, or are there ways that we in our own practice,
So I wrote an article, a piece for the National Urban Trails. If you Google it, you can find it, about my experience as a Black man. It was written for Black History Month, being on a trail. I'm a runner. And just the feeling that I get, and I offered some testimonials of some other people experiencing trails and how they felt not welcome. And at the end, I just offered a simple solution, because I'm running and there's someone that's looking at the river and their bike is there and they're running back thinking I'm going to steal it. I'm running sweating. I'm not going to steal your bike. But just a simple hello, how are you? A head nod just lets people know that you're welcome, because as a Black American, bad stuff happens in the woods. And they say, why aren't people of color coming out to trails? It's like, because bad things happen in the woods. I don't know what's happening around the corner. But I think the whole point is that we have to do the small things for people to feel welcome. When we design parks in New York City, I've been to places where they're saying, well, we don't want to have a basketball court. No, it's not you don't want to have a basketball court. It's who uses the basketball court. And I applaud Detroit, because they put a court in the center of downtown in Campus Marsh, and nothing's happening. And as one resident said, oh, I don't know about basketball court, the noise, the language. And I said, have you ever watched pickleball? And he was like, wow, that's a good point. Yeah, so I think how we frame this, how we perceive, how we racialize public space, Marcus was absolutely correct. the monuments, the images, the rules. In New York City, we had a sign you couldn't loiter in a park. That is crazy. That's what you do in a park is loiter, which is sit or stand with no apparent purpose. But that rule could be racialized. And if you're 4 Black or brown teenagers, you're loitering. If you're 2 nice, gorgeous white couples sitting on a bench, enjoy yourselves. So he's right. And it's something we have to think about. When I was in New York, we quadrupled the amount of seating. We doubled down on doing more basketball courts. And we made sure there were places for people of color to eat, because when they go to public spaces, for them, it's a social gathering. They want to break bread, they want to eat, they want to hang out, and a restroom, which is critically important. And so many of our parks and public spaces don't have those things, which is basically saying, you're not welcome here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and taking that into another layer of perhaps lack of inclusion, Brian Lemmerman has a question here. New urbanism has become known for increasing property values and bringing more benefits to those with the wealth and access to it. What can we do to make sure more people can enjoy places created and recreated based on these principles? To what extent do we have the influence to regulate financial support and affordability? I know that's a hard one.
It cuts both ways. I'm not sure. Yes, CNU has been accused of being a profession for the affluent or the privileged. But, I don't want to be controversial, but there are some places that they're happy to see property values increase because now they want to retire. They don't see it as gentrification. They're like saying, my goodness, my house was worth 50,000. Someone wants to offer me 300. I can now retire and go somewhere. The others are saying they're being forced out. It's hard unless you're very determined in your design to make sure that you're providing housing for all and not for the privileged. You want to have a mix of density and opportunity, something that CNU truly supports, from missing middle to ADUs, to ensure you have mixed use developments where everyone feels welcome. If that is intentional and top of mind, I think our designs will work. But understand that some of our approaches, you must have that engagement. I've heard many communities, something CNU advocates is bike lanes. There are some communities saying, when I see a bike lane, I'm saying no, because that's the first sign of gentrification. But urbanists will say, no, that's an important tool in our toolbox. So it's hyper local. You need to talk to community, find out what works. But if you're going in with all the right thoughts and values, we're planning for people, not for place, to make sure that it's a place where attainable, if not affordable, and be very careful that what you're recommending does not increase affordability, increase value in one place and then puts pressure on other neighborhoods. So it's surgical. It is not easy, but it's a great question.
Yeah. Well, and there is a related question that sort of filters into this of local, that local communities often need to overcome the continued use of restrictive private covenants that limit the access, exactly as you're talking about, that limit the creation of ADUs, require single unit homes only, et cetera, that exclusionary limitation that then pushes the pressure into other parts of the community.
Yeah, when I was planning director, I said, I should tell these residents, you think I'm bad? Did you see some of these homeowner associations and restrictive covenants? I mean, like, phew. And the way they enforce it is I think there should be a whole overlook and limitation on what homeowners association can do and what is deemed to be illegal in restrictive covenants. I agree. Many of them are exclusive, and that to me is the opposite of being inclusive. So I think that we have to be loud and clear that our goal is create inclusive communities. That's part of that board statement. That is our role of CNU. And like I said, we got to be loud and fight against it, whether you're in the public or private sector, because our goal is to create inclusive communities, not exclusive communities. And sadly, some of our famous new urbanist development lean toward that side. So some repentance and redemption will be.
Fair, very fair. Well, we have one last question here, looking at the end of the hour, but it relates to here in Detroit. The question's from Healy Sutton, who says, I'm glad so many cities are acknowledging their terrible history and trying to make it right. But if that doesn't come with changes to what's going on today, it seems fairly pointless. I think particularly of what seems to my layperson brain like a very unequal development happening to revitalize Detroit. And I wonder if you could just give a little bit of perspective on maybe not Detroit specifically, or if you'd like to, please do, enjoying where I am. But, you know, the intentionality behind making sure that it is not unequal, as Healy describes.
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to those three words. It is acknowledge, apologize, and atone. Atone is where we have to hold people accountable. Many places, Canada has a land acknowledgement. Yes, some will apologize, but it's the atonement. Okay, if I'm sorry, what am I going to do about it? And so it requires a change. It could be a change in me. It could be a change in the way I work. It could be a change of addressing the community that's being harmed. But to get to our question, atonement takes very different forms. It's not a monetary contribution or repayment, but it could take other forms. And I think in Detroit and other places, we've got to hold people accountable to the atone. And I don't know what the atone is for Detroit versus Indianapolis versus Flint, Michigan. But that to me is where the conversation should really occur, and how CNU can play a role in what does that atonement look like, because we all have to acknowledge harm was created. So that's more of a generic, more higher level response, but I'm always looking for the atone. Yes, you apologized. Yes, you acknowledged, but now what are you going to do about it? To me, that's the real power of apologizing and acknowledging for past harms.
Well, looking at the end of the hour, I want to thank you so much, Mitch, for being willing to recreate this presentation, which was, well, very much a lot of positive feedback at CNU 31, and we knew that we wanted to have you be able to share that with more folks. And as the chat and the questions sort of indicate, this is a topic that folks in the Norbanism really want to continue to talk about, but also want to learn from and improve our own practice. And so I'm really grateful for you sharing with us today, and thank everybody for joining us. And we will see folks on the park bench at the next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
I'm just seeing the comments now. Hello to everyone I know. Wasn't looking at them, so I wasn't distracted. Thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Rob. This has been a pleasure to join you this morning or afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.